Hello, welcome to another White Davy Q&A live. Today we'll be just chit-chatting about worms, whatever it is that you wish to discuss, and we'll also be discussing a bit about worm castings. Just a minute, let me turn my lights on. So how are you today? I'm so excited that it is the weekend. I've got so much work that I need to get done outside, so I'm looking forward to the weekend. I need to go on the road, although I don't like to be on the road on the weekends, but that's fine. Okay, so if there's anything that you would like to talk about, feel free to let me know. In the meantime, we're going to be discussing worm castings. So, one question that you get asked a lot is if worm casting has a high level of nitrogen. I see, and no, worm castings contain 5 times more nitrogen, 7 times more phosphorus, and 11 times more potassium than ordinary soil. Oh, hi, Mom. Yeah, so it does contain a reasonable amount of nitrogen. 5 times more nitrogen, 7 times more phosphorus, and 11 times more potassium than ordinary soil. Now, can you over fertilize your with worm castings? What do you think? Do you think you can over fertilize with worm castings? With most fertilizers or supplements, I know that in some region worm casting is recognized as a fertilizer, but in Canada it is recognized as a supplement and not a fertilizer. But I'll be saying fertilizer, and if I do, I'm talking about the worm castings. Oh, Han White. Yes, you're correct. You cannot over fertilize with worm castings. As you know, from most persons might be aware that worm casting is actually the byproduct or the dung of worms. With most animal dung, you can over fertilize with them and they have the potential of burning your plants and stuff like that. But with worm castings, they do not burn your plants. Chemical fertilizers also burn your plants, but worm castings do not harm your plants. In fact, it is more beneficial. It has more benefits to your plants than most other types of animal byproduct. Now, one question that people tend to ask, oh, hi, Russell, and the answer tend to be a bit conflicting. I guess it is based on each person's experience, is how should you use your worm castings? And the opinion on this varies. So it is recommended that you had at least 1/8 to a quarter cup of to a quarter inch of worm castings or more every 2 to 3 months, and this will help to build up your soil. But as I mentioned before, you cannot add too much, so that is the good thing, but you can add too little. So you can do this, and it depends also on the type of plants that you're using it for. That is also going to determine how frequently you use your worm castings. And we're going to be elaborating on this a little bit further down in the discussion. Yeah, so how long do worm castings last in the soil? This too is dependent on a lot of factors. It can last up to 6 months or even longer depending on how it is stored. So if you keep your worm castings out of sunlight and out of UV lights, some grow lights, and at a temperature between 60 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, then this will help your worm castings to last longer. So the temperature does matter. We also mentioned in previous lives that it is important not to allow your worm castings to freeze, because while the castings will still maintain all its nutrients, the one main thing that is going to be affected if your casting is allowed to freeze is the microbes that are in your worm castings. So you don't want to allow your castings to freeze. Now, can castings be added just to the top of your soil? It certainly can. You can add it to the top of your soil. You can add it in the holes that you're planting in, or yes, and white, you're correct. So you can add it to the holes that you're planting in. You can actually add it to the soil and mix it into the soil before planting. And you can mix it long in advance before planting as well. Now, why is worm casting more expensive than compost and other soil additives? Do you know? The price for castings, it can be pretty expensive, and it depends also on your supplier. There are various qualities of worm castings. It depends on your location where you are. But what is it that makes worm casting more expensive than compost and other soil additives? It is because worm castings take longer to produce, and excuse me, and it has a higher level of nutrients and microbes. Let's see, and why it says it's better and have more nutrients because of the worms. Yes, so true. And it is also beneficial for hydrating and aerating your soil, and it helps to control some pathogens that are in your soil. So because of these reasons, worm castings tend to be more expensive than compost and soil additives. Do all worm casting provide the same benefits? That depends. As with everything else that is out there are many factors that affect worm castings quality. For example, how is it made? When you are feeding your worms, do you feed the worms, or do the suppliers feed the worm mostly carbon based food source? Do they feed them only nitrogen based food source, or do they use a combination of both? Is the castings allowed to freeze and thaw? Was the casting allowed to dry out? How old is the castings? So all of these factors will affect the quality of your worm castings. And even if you feed your worms equal amount or of worm cast of food scraps, sorry, what is important is the consistency of what you're feeding your worms. So if you know that your worms eat a pound of food scraps for the day, and you're going to be feeding them half pound of this is just an example, so I'm not saying you're to feed them using this ratio, But if you're going to be feeding them half pound of greens and half pounds of browns, meaning that you're carbon and nitrogen based, you want to ensure that every time you feed them, you maintain that ratio. Because if you're feeding them, say half and half, sometimes and another times you have 60-40, or another time you have 70-30, then the quality of your worm casting is constantly going to be changing. So you want to maintain a constant ratio when feeding your worms. And if you're buying worm castings from suppliers, then it might be a good idea to find out about such information as well, because you want to ensure that you are getting consistent castings, because this can affect your production. Now, do worm casting attract bugs? Would mine change based on how I feed them? You're asking if the quality of your worm casting would change. Well, I think before you personally, Han White, my feeding method is pretty consistent in terms of how you feed your worms. So it doesn't matter if you give them more tomatoes today and more lettuce tomorrow. What is important is that you're consistent in how much of each source you give them. So if you're feeding them tomato or lettuce, all of that is considered to be greens, nitrogen based foods. So it's not really about the type of food, it's about whether it is greens or browns. You want to make sure that it is consistent. So if every day you give them food scraps and that is the main thing that you give them, then that is what their nutrients is going to be based on. One important factor to consider, however, is that based on what the worms eat, their bodies convert what you feed them into the type of nutrients that the plants need, but they are still affected based on what you feed them. But the method that you use on white is pretty good, because you're giving them shredded papers, you're giving them uh, the eggshells, and you're giving them a consistent supply of greens, your food scraps. So yours should not be affected because you're pretty consistent. Let's see. Russell says, oh, and White says, I feed them food scraps every other day. Yes, how often you feed them is not so much what is important as being consistent with what you're feeding them. That is what is most important. Russell says, worm castings made the same way with A and C's or European night crawlers. Quarter-inch top dressing castings from Euro will turn into soil in about 3 to 4 weeks. A and C castings top dress 75 plus days. Okay, that's interesting. So let's see that again. For the Euros, it is 3 to 4 weeks, but for the ANC, it is actually 75 days. Oh, so does that mean that the Euros eat faster than the African night crawlers? It's interesting. You're welcome, Ann White. Yes, so I was about to ask if worm casting attract bugs. The casting itself does not attract bugs. The food scraps in your worm bins do attract bugs. And so you will find that you will have a few bugs in the finished product, but the casting itself does not necessarily attract bugs. In fact, we're going to be elaborating on this a little bit more in the discussion. Yes, so the casting itself does not necessarily attract bugs. Can castings ward off pests? Oh, okay. Russell says, I'm talking about how long it takes for the castings to break down in the soil. Interesting that the different type of worms casting will take longer than other types of worms. That's pretty interesting. 75 days for the African night crawlers and 3 to 4 weeks for the ENC, for the Euro. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so yes, can castings ward off crop pests? It certainly can. Worm castings make a good pesticide for things like whiteflies and spider mites, aphids, and other insects that feed on the juice of your plant leaves. Research show that when casting is added around plants, it actually increased the production of an enzyme that is called chitinase, and this enzyme cause chitin to break down. And chitin is a substance that is made up of the exoskeleton of various types of insects. So the chitinase break this down. So when insects actually feed on the leaves of your plants that have absorbed the chitinase, then it will cause the exoskeleton of those insects that feed on the plants to gradually dissolve, and this will result in their deaths. So that makes worm casting a good pesticide. Now, what's the best way to use worm castings? This too, the opinion on it varies, and I guess it is based on everyone's experience and based on research that has been done by others. But even though research has been done by many different sources across the globe, it's still based on the condition that those worms grow up in, what they're fed, what temperatures they are exposed to. So everything, there are so many factors that affect worm castings. So how can you know the best way to use worm castings? It's all going to be a matter of trial and error. However, it is recommended that for flower beds and vegetable gardens, you use quarter to half cup of castings for every 100 square foot of garden that you have. And while this is so, there are others who will use 1 tablespoon of castings per plant. Some use even a cup of castings per plant. Now, if you have fruit bearing plants, vegetables, and heavy feeders, then it may be a good idea to add castings every month, especially when these plants start flowering. Then you want to pay more attention to how much nutrients you give the plants at that point in time. Now, for household plants and container plants, it is recommended that you use a quarter cup for every 6 diameter of the container. So if your container is 6 inches in diameter, then you'd use a quarter cup of worm castings. If it is 12 inches in diameter, then it's recommended that you use half cup of worm castings. And this you're going to be repeating monthly because container gardening require far more water and nutrients than regular garden planting in the ground. Oh, hi, her healthy home. Yes, so If you're planting in containers, then it requires more castings than if you're planting in the ground. So you're going to be adding more castings for container gardening, and you're going to be doing it more frequently than if you're planting directly in the ground. Okay. Castings can also be added to your compost bin because one, it is going to increase the amount of microbes that you have in your worm bin, and it is also going to be adding a lot of beneficial nutrients to the um, to the compost bin, and it can also help to kickstart your composting. So it is recommended that for your compost bin you add 1/8 to quarter-eighth of an inch layer of castings between every layer of composting material that you put to your worm bins, and you can add this casting every 2 to 3 months to your compost bin. You can also use worm castings to make worm tea, and the formula that is used for this varies from person to person. Some will use 1 cup of casting for a gallon of water. Some will use 2 cups of castings for 5 gallons of water. Depending on how strong you want it or how weak you want it, then that is going to determine how much you actually use to make your worm tea. But what is important is not how strong or how weak you might want that worm tea to be. What is important is that when you create your formula, you're going to mix it and you're going to allow it to steep for anything from 24 hours to several days. But the thing about worm casting is that it has a short shelf life, only 3 days. So it's recommended that when you're making your worm tea, you don't make it before you're actually ready to use it because it won't last very long. Let's see, Russell says, I have been seriously thinking about using chitin in my worm chow, sourced from crabs and shrimp shells waste. 40 pounds per bag. 40-pound bags are $60. I am trying to find it cheaper though. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, that's not a bad price. But I need to move out to where you are, because it seems as if wherever you're living, you get things for your worm farm quite reasonable. After we were talking about that, the diatomaceous earth and the quantity that you can get it for, the quantity that you can get for a low price, I started looking around at feed shop here. One person got back to me, and the largest quantity that they carry is a 25-pound, no, 25 pound or 25 kilogram bag. Yes, 25 kilogram bag. But I keep asking for the price, but there is no price forthcoming. So I guess I'm gonna still be looking around. Yeah, but where you are, Russell, you seem to be able to get quite a few things reasonable for your worm farm, which is pretty good. Right. So how can you tell if your worm casting contain sand or compost or other unwanted material? Because it is customary for people who are selling these things to add things to it just to increase the volume or to increase the weight if they're sell it based on volume or weight. So how can you tell if the castings that you're getting is actually pure? Pure castings will look like black coffee grounds. If you use a 20-ounce bottle, two of them with a wide mouth, and you want it wide because you need to get the castings in there. Using two 20-ounce container, you're going to place 4 ounces of pure worm castings in one container and the same amount, 4 ounces, in another container. Both castings must come from separate suppliers because you're testing them and you need to see the results. So you can't use casting from one supplier. And so make them yourself. Okay. Yes, that is so true. So true, Russell. It's the best way to go. You know exactly what you're getting when you make it yourself. Good question, Our Healthy Home. I'm going to be touching on that a little bit from now. Yes, so we'll get to that as quickly. So back to worm castings, how you can tell if it is pure. So when you get these two containers and castings from more than one supplier, you're going to add 4 ounces of castings to each of these containers. Fill the containers with water and shake it up well, and then let it sit for 5 minutes. Now you're going to be checking to see if it contains weed seeds. Seeds usually tend to float, so if it is that's in there, then you're going to be able to tell. Um, you are also going to be checking for material that has not been composted by the worms. If the casting contains sand, mark you there are some people who had sand to their worm bin for grit, and that is okay. But if they're adding grit to your worm bin, you would not be adding a large amount where it's going to affect the weight or the volume of the castings. It's just a very small amount that you would need to add. But if they're adding sand to increase volume or weight, then what you're going to observe is that the sand is going to settle first after you've had the water and let it sit for 5 minutes. Pour the liquid off and then dump out the sediments. Examine the content. Now, if the material feels muddy, it probably is mud and not worm castings. Because each worm cast is coated with calcium, so it takes a longer time for the worm casting to dissolve. So this is one way that you're going to know that it is worm casting and not mud, because it won't dissolve so readily. If they have dirt or compost in it, then it will become very muddy. Right. Now the worm casting, because it is coated with calcium, it will maintain its shape. And this is how you're going to know that yes, the castings that you have is pure or it is not pure. So when you have that castings that you have thrown out of the container, if you hold it in your hand and you squeeze it, when you go like this, it should crumble. If it doesn't crumble, then you know that you do not have pure castings, because worm castings crumble very easily. It will not stick together and stay that way. If you had just a little bit of pressure to it, it will crumble. Now you need to keep in mind all of the things that I've been discussing in this live so far. It is not a hard and fast rule. So how much castings you can use in your garden and stuff like that, these are not hard and fast rules. They are just guidelines. So if you use these guidelines, then you can make adjustment based on what you observe in your garden. So what if you, oh, hi, Cindy Squirrel. So if you read where it says use a quarter cup of worm castings in for maybe 10 plants, and I'm just giving an example, and you notice that your plants seem to need more nutrients, then naturally you're going to be adding more worm castings. If you use maybe a tablespoon for two plants and you see that it needs more, you're going to be adding more. You cannot add too much castings, but you can add too little. So you are going to have to use the guideline that is given and observe to see how it performs so you can know if you need to add more. As I mentioned before, the quality of worm casting, if you did not produce your own, varies from supplier to supplier based on what they're fed, based on the conditions that the casting is exposed to, how it is stored, and things like that. So you are going to have to observe your plants and see how well your plants are doing when you had the worm castings in order to know how much you're going to be giving your plants. And it is a good idea to keep record of what you're doing with your worm casting so that the next time you go to plant the same type of crop, then you will have a good idea as to how much castings you really need. But like Russell rightly says, your best option is to make your own castings because then you have full control over the quality of the worm castings. And you don't have to be paying a large amount of money for castings because worm castings can be pretty expensive. Some sell it by weight, some sell it by the gallon. So if you produce your own, then it work out a whole lot better for you because then the only thing that you're paying for is maybe if you live in an environment that is cold, you might have to pay for heating if you do not have them in your home. Like me, I have it in the garage, and so you have to pay for heating for the garage. You have to pay for the worm bin, you have to buy the worm. You're using back the residue from the plants in your garden to feed them, and you're using the food scraps that would go to waste from your home to feed them. But if you have to buy castings, it can be pretty expensive. And if you're going to be buying castings in a small amount, that can be pretty expensive too. So if you're buying in bulk, some suppliers will sell at a lower price if you buy in bulk. So all of these things you need to consider when you're planning to use worm castings in your garden. Okay, so you were asking our healthy home about what crops worm castings are best for. I'm going to be elaborating on that a little bit shortly. Now we're going to be looking at some of the disadvantages of worm castings, and there are not many disadvantages. Unlike other animal byproduct that can have a lot of disadvantages, whether it is increased pathogens in your garden or they burn your plants, stuff like that, worm casting does not have a lot of disadvantages. So here are three disadvantages of worm castings. I don't even know if one of them is really a disadvantage per se. For plants that require macronutrients, other source of fertilizer might be needed because worm casting only contain a small amount of trace nutrients or macronutrients. So that's one disadvantage. You might have to use additional fertilizer if plants require more macronutrients. Plants that are acid loving do not do well in worm castings because worm casting will neutralize your soil. So any plants that does not love acidic soil can do well in worm castings. So it means then that things like your berries, whether your strawberries, raspberries, or any form of berries, they will not do well in worm castings because these require acidic environment, and the worm casting will neutralize the acid in your soil. But every other plant, it is okay to use worm castings with it. My kids are going crazy out there. Yes. And then the third disadvantage is that for worm castings, if you are not buying but are producing your own, then it can take months for you to produce the amount of castings that you need. But then that is also dependent on how much worms you have and how long in advance do you need in the worm casting you've actually started your worm bin. So if you're buying castings, fine, it is relatively available in some areas, not all. As you know, worm casting is just starting to gain popularity, so it might not be readily available in a lot of areas. But if you're thinking of starting your own worm bin, it is always best to start a few months, at least 3 to 6 months before you're ready to use the worm castings, because initially it's going to take time for the worms to settle in and for the worms to produce enough castings that you can use in your garden. And when you're just starting out, if depending on how much worms you're starting with, most people start off with a pound of worms. You, depending on the size of the garden that you have, you may not have enough castings to take care of your entire garden, but it is recommended that you start a few months before you actually need that casting. Oh, hi, New Art Gardener. Uh, so keep that in mind if you're thinking about starting a worm farm. So producing your own is actually the best method for you, because it is cheaper and you can control the qualities. Just those two advantages alone makes it worth the effort. And sometimes you might want the benefit of the worm castings, but you might not want to be raising the worms. You can always build worm towers in your garden so that you don't have to handle worms. And if you don't want to build worm towers in your garden, then you can just bury the food scraps in your garden. It will invite the worms that are native to your environment into your garden. Or the other option is, whether you're going to be using a worm tower or you're going to be burying food scraps, what you could do is buy the worms and let them go in the garden and just keep adding your food scraps to the garden. And the worms will do all the work for you, and then you don't have to maintain them. The only disadvantage of that is if you live in an environment with freezing temperatures, then your worms, if they're not burrowing worms, they will freeze. Some worms will burrow down deep into the soil, some will burrow down as deep as 12 feet into the soil. If they're not burrowing worms, then they're going to freeze, but you will always have worms in your garden. So every year you're going to lose most of your worms, but then because the worm eggs or the worm cocoons do not freeze, or if they freeze, the eggs will not die. So because of that, you will always have those worms in your garden. The first year when I bought my worms, I was told that I cannot allow them to freeze. So I had to harvest them and put them inside because the worms would freeze. But then I noticed after the first winter, after I got my worms, I was able to see mature worms in my garden. It wasn't a lot of them, just occasional one and two here and there, but some of the worms actually survived the winter. And these are red wigglers. And that was last year, but the year before last, I went around the neighborhood and rake in front of people's yard, rake the street and collected the leaves and put it in my garden. And then I was going to a restaurant to collect food scraps. So I had quite a few piles of leaves and food scraps where I had practically all of my main garden covered with it. And when I say covered, I mean a high pile, 3 to 4 feet high. And throughout the thawing season, The amount of red wigglers that I saw in there was quite a lot for worms in your garden. It wouldn't be the same quantity as you would see in your worm bin, but I was surprised to see quite a few red wigglers surviving in there during the winter. So, yes, if you don't want to be handling the worms, but you want the benefits of it, then you can always just buy the worms and put them in your garden, and you will have the worm castings without having to do all the work. Oh, you're welcome, Her Healthy Home. Now, here is a little fact for you about worm castings. Did you know that depending on the quality of the worm castings that you have, worm casting may cause your plant to grow or to produce up to 50% more than in other source of plant nutrients? So your plants can grow 50% more than if you use other nutrients. And the production from your plants, the fruits that you get, the vegetable that you get from your plants, can increase 50% up to. So it doesn't have to be 50%, it can be anything from 0 to 50%. So up to 50% more when you use worm castings. So this is one of the benefits, a major benefit of using worm castings. And as I mentioned before, it works pretty well as a pesticide, which is pretty great. It does not, the worm casting does not eradicate the pathogens that are in your soil, but it will help to keep them under control. Let's see, and wife says, or start a compost bin with holes in the bottom of the bin in order to invite worms. Yes. I know you would suggest something like that because that is how you got your worm bin started. You started off with a compost bin, and then your European night crawlers just found your bin, and look at the amount of them that you have now. Yes, that wouldn't really work well in my region for me though, because we don't really have native composting worms here. We have just like the regular earthworms. So that wouldn't necessarily, but they do well too. So even though the regular earthworms are not composting worms, they do eat the food scraps and make castings, and the casting is just as good as if it is composting worms that you're using. So if you want to create the worm bin and the compost bin and put it in your garden so that the worms can go in and out, then that too works pretty well as on white is. See, Newark Gardener says, I found red worms in my raised bed this week, so I'm assuming it's good soil. Nice, nice. Russell says, I am hoping that in the future you have a population of CNC thriving in your garden, considering you let them loose outside. Yes, I would love that, but you know what? I'm not holding my breath because every time we go fishing and we have worms left over, I put them in the garden. I used to put them in my kids' garden before I relocated it. And only once have I ever seen a Canadian nightcrawler. I saw what, two or three Canadian nightcrawlers, and they were fairly young in that garden. And the only reason I was able to see those Canadian nightcrawlers is actually because I relocated the bed, and on the bottom of the bed, they were digging down into the soil. And so I managed to see three of them. But outside of that, I've never really seen them. And every year, I've been doing this for years, I think probably about 8 years now, I've been releasing those Canadian night crawlers in my garden, and so far I've only seen three. So I don't know. I don't know what's going on. Maybe they're there and I'm not seeing them because, like I said, If I didn't relocate the kids' bed, I wouldn't see those three. They were not in the raised bed, they were just on the ground underneath the raised bed. So, yes. So, I guess the fact that they were pretty young means that they are there and they are reproducing, but I don't get to see them. But it would be nice, Russell. It would be really nice if I could see them running around and playing in there. Yes, well, time will tell, I guess. And every year I have so far, I haven't released any of my European night crawlers in my raised bed yet because I don't know. I just got them last year, so I want to build my population. But I'm thinking I'm going to be doing that sometime this year, release it just a few, and then we'll see what happens. But the red wigglers, I definitely have been putting them in all of my raised beds. One particular raised bed, I put about a pound of worms in. And then when the season was up last year, I took them out and put them in a container in the garage because I didn't want them to freeze. And I'm going to be putting them back in that. Well, maybe I should put them in another raised bed and see how many worms are going to be in that raised beds that they were in last year. I want to see if any of what remain in there survive, and I want to see if they laid a lot of cocoons in there. But it would be interesting to see. Rano, Raraku, I hope I got that right. How do you raise your Canadian nightcrawlers? Do you put them only in paper slash kitchen scraps, or do you use soil too? Sometimes, like initially when I'm starting the bin, I put a bit of soil in there because I know they say they like soil. But then if I'm thinking of selling that casting, I would not be putting soil in there because I don't want to be selling my clients soil. But if you're using it for your backyard purposes, then you can put soil in there because they love to burrow down into the soil. And you can use newspaper, just anything like regular worm bins. The only problem with the Canadian night crawlers, and as Russell mentioned that I released mine, is that they are one of the most difficult worms to raise. They do well in Canada because it is cool if they are out in the wild, but if you have them in captivity, then they don't do so well unless you are able to regulate their temperature. So you have to keep them cool. You cannot allow them to go over 65 degrees Fahrenheit because they just will not do well. So you have to have them in an environment where you can keep them cool all year round. You don't have to worry about them in the winter, but you definitely have to worry about them in the summer. So I got rid of mine because it was too difficult to raise them, and I don't really intend to have to pay for the resources to keep them cool. So if you have an AC condition inside your home or inside your garage and you want to raise them, then that would be fine. But outside of that, they can be tricky. My point is, will they survive if you put them in paper and organic matter? Yes, they will survive. Yes, they will survive if you don't have the soil to eat. They don't have to have soil because the ones that I was raising, one set, the first set that I started off with, I had a soil and they did well. And the other set that I started out with after I emptied out that container, they were just in paper and food scraps and they did well. But when the time got hot, then they didn't do so well. But yes, they can survive in just paper and food scraps. If it snows again, I will shovel the garden bed and dump worms in them for the robins. Oh, okay, nice. Yeah, I don't have that much worms that I can be feeding the robins or any other birds for that matter. Yeah, I don't know. This year was not such a good year for me with my worms because of the freezing that occurred. The ones that remained in the bin, they survived the freezing, but the ones, it seemed that a lot of them crawled out of the bin when the bin got very cold. So it was quite a loss for me. So I don't know. And then it seemed as if when I put food scraps in the bin, which is why I don't feed my bin food scraps, the mice go in there to eat the food scraps, and any worms that are on the food scraps get eaten or killed. So yeah, this year wasn't such a good year for me and my poor little worms. But oh, hi, Melanie. Hopefully next year or before the winter comes, I'll be able to have the entire worm farm fully mice proof. Then I can start thinking about feeding them food scraps. But if I'm going to be feeding them food scraps, I still have to consider the fruit flies because I don't really want to have them breeding up in my garage. So I'm going to have to use window screen around the entire, well, maybe not around the entire worm farm. What I can do is what I've always been doing with my previous worm bins, where I rat proof the worm farm, and then for the bins, I just use the window screen to make covers for them. So that is one of the projects that I'm going to be working on for this summer. Oh my goodness. I've got so many projects to work on for this summer, and so many of them has to be done before the winter gets here. The eating of the garage, or at least getting the heat to circulate in the entire garage instead of just in one location. So I have that to get done. I have the rat proofing to get done. I have the covers for the worm bins to get done. Oh my goodness. Plus the yard maintenance. There's so much work to be done. But anyway, I'll get there eventually. Okay, you're telling Rano to keep the temperature below 60 for the Canadian night crawlers. Yes, in temperatures above 20 degrees C, they stop being lively. Yeah. But they are just fine in temperatures 18 to 21, especially those in my country. I live in Balkan Peninsula in Europe. Okay. Yeah. It's funny how I live in Canada and yet still I have to I have to be providing cooling for these other guys in the summer. But now they're free. We'll see what they do if they show up in my garden. I'm hoping I didn't put them out, release them a little bit too early. But we'll see what happens. Okay, so all of what I've discussed is what I have prepared to discuss with you guys today. So if there's anything else that you would like to discuss, then feel free to do so. And if not, then I'm gonna say goodbye and go get some work done on my yard. Melanie, did you see today's video? The video that I put up today, did you get to see it? I think you will like it. Was working in the backyard and miss it. Not yet. Okay. Yeah, you're gonna like today's video because it is about that the sweet potato slips that you gave me. I got them. When was that? Uh, Today is what, Friday? So I got them Wednesday, and you should see me. My little girl says, "Mommy is going crazy again," because when I saw the package, my husband brought it in and says, "Oh, this looked like something your sister would send." I'm like, "I'm not expecting anything from my sister." And then I look on it and I saw your name. I'm like, "Oh, it's my sweet potato. And I started singing and dancing around the house. And my daughter was just looking at me like, are you going crazy again? Yeah, so I planted it right away. I didn't waste any time. Yes. Let's see. For the Canadian night crawlers, I like to use newspaper shredded to pinpoint size with clay mixed in. Okay. I don't really have clay here. I'd have to buy the clay. Well, that depends. I could go on a job site and find clay. What do you think about these worms in my compost in Jamaica? They would do well. The Canadian night crawlers definitely not. They wouldn't survive a day in Jamaica. But like the European night crawlers and the red wrigglers, the African night crawlers are the blue worms. Those would definitely do well out there. And if it is in the if it's not in your yard but in the part of the property where you grow your trees and stuff, you don't even have to have a worm bin. You just let them go in the soil. If you Because I know that between traveling home and back to where you are now, it's you might not be able to maintain the worms if you're keeping them in a worm bin. So if you're going to be taking them to Jamaica, just take them and release them in the soil. So it doesn't matter what type you're taking. The only thing I would recommend though is if you're going to be taking them back home, try to bring eggs. Even if you're going to bring worms, try to bring eggs because the eggs can survive a lot of temperatures as long as it's not too hot. And I don't think it will be too hot in containers if you're taking the eggs with you. If you're shipping it, I'm not sure because it can take a while to get there unless you expedite it. So yes, bring both eggs and worms and just release it there, and it should be fine. Because with all those trees and everything dropping their leaves and stuff, the worms are gonna have food consistently, so you don't have to worry about them. And then with the amount of rainfall and everything, then you won't have to worry about them. If when you go home you want to start a worm bin, then you just dig around where you release the worms. You can just dig an area, put some food scraps there, and the worms will gradually migrate to it, and then you just take them out and start your worm farm. Yes, that's what I'm thinking of doing. I'm thinking of just sending out some eggs and just ask a friend to release it on our property. And then when I go out, when I'm ready to start my worm farm out there, I just use the food scraps to attract them and start the worms. Let's see. Was it still alive? Yes, Melanie, it was still alive. One of the plant had started growing a little bit of fungus on it, one of the sweet potatoes, but they were still alive. The leaves were not in very good condition, but I think the plants are okay. They looked okay. Hello, Melanie, and good night. Okay. Russell, or Rana talking to Russell says, I keep them in soil in the winter and give them all kinds of scraps, even lemon, potato peels, and oranges. And in the summer, I use this soil for raising my tomatoes and peppers, etc. seedlings. Nice. They really enrich the soil greatly. They're definitely worth having. She's talking about the worm she has been seeing in her compost bin in Jamaica. They are red worms. Okay. I don't really know what type of red worms they are. If they're red wrigglers, I've never really seen red wrigglers in Jamaica. But it doesn't mean that they're not there because worms, the red wrigglers had to come from somewhere, right? So it doesn't mean that they're not there. But yes, um, those worms should be fine. And then again, if they like to go in and out of your bin, that is fine because then you're not there to do all the work. You just reap the benefit from it. Oh, hi, Urban Girl Gardening. Leafy Wiggy. Do you ship worms anywhere? I do ship worms, but I don't really ship worms outside of Canada. And that is because I'm having a bit of difficulty. Even shipping across Canada sometimes is tricky because a lot of these shipping companies do not want to handle it because they don't want, if something go wrong, then they have to take responsibility. So a lot of them, you have difficulty finding people who are willing to ship the worms. So because of that, I only ship them across Canada. And then it is also expensive to ship to the US. You can source worms from, well, depending on where you are. So if you're in the US, you can get worms from the US. If you're in Europe, you can get worms from Europe. So just try to find the location that is closest to you in order to get worms because it's going to be cheaper where shipping is concerned. And it is more likely that your worms are going to arrive alive. See, Russell says, Rano, one of my favorite things to do with Canadian night crawlers is use them in the winter for revitalizing root ball. Interesting. Yeah, interesting. I hope they bounce back. Was worried. Yeah, I think they will be fine. I think they'll be fine, Melanie. I have them on my windowsill at the moment. I'm wondering if maybe I should put them underneath the grow lights. I just might do that. Leafy Wiggy. How about Sask, as in Saskatoon or Saskatchewan? Yes, I do ship across Saskatchewan. It's my favorite place to ship since as that's where I am. So it makes it a bit easier, more likely for the worms to arrive safe. So yes, I do ship across Saskatchewan. What is the main difference which helps you to differentiate red wigglers from European night crawlers? They are similar in appearance in terms of their color, but the European night crawlers are larger. Of course, there's a point in their growing stage where they're going to be the same size as red wigglers. The European nightcrawler body tends to be more solid to the touch than the European nightcrawlers. The European nightcrawlers, their body is firm when you touch them, and they tend to have a flatter head than the red wigglers. I'm gonna have to look back again on that information that I had on them because I did some research a few months ago on what differentiates them apart from just their size and stuff. I know that sometimes they tend to have stripes on them, but then sometimes I see red wigglers in my bin with a little bit of stripes on them. So, but yes, I'm gonna have to look back at that. I have very bad memory, so a lot of times I have to be checking notes to remember the things that I should know. Yeah, sorry about that. I don't really remember all the difference. Let's see. Kiki says, I get my worms from Walmart. Okay, yes, I've heard that quite a few people get worms from Walmart. I don't know if worms are sold at Walmart in my regions, but quite a few people have been getting worms from Walmart. What type of worms do you get from there, Kiki? When the worms are healthy, the European should have gray underside and reds will be red. Okay, thanks for that, Russell. I just started my European Nightcrawler worm bin. That was what, June last year, and most of them are in a large 55-gallon container. So I don't really get to see the worms much. I just get to feed them and know that they're there. So I don't get to see them much, and their size is not. I don't have any really large one yet. As well, as far as I know, I don't really go through the bin enough to see what's there. So I haven't been able to do a comparison with them just yet. But with time, I intend to do just so. Okay, so Rana says that's great choice, but in the late spring I free them in my garden or they will just die in summer. I don't have cool enough place to raise them all year. Okay, well, that's nice. Yes, I know quite a few people do that with the Canadian night crawlers. They would raise them in the cooler weather and then they release them as soon as the time starts to get warm. But it's nice to do that. You get the benefit from them, and at the same time, you're not allowing them to die. Melanie says, I found some baby worms in my castings. Will they grow? Oh, they will definitely grow. So, what I would recommend that you do with that, Melanie, in the castings, I don't know if you started using the castings yet. If you're using them in pots, you're going to have mature worms in your pots eventually, and you can just take them out and have a little container that you prepare like a regular worm bin and just put food scraps in there. Or you can just bait those baby worms because there's going to be eggs in that castings and there are going to be baby worms in there. So what you can do is just get a small container, put some holes in it, put food scraps in it and cover it and put it in the worm castings. And when the eggs hatch and those hatchlings that are already in the castings, they're going to gravitate to the food and you can just take that out and put it and use it to start your worm bin. So you might not have a lot of worms, but you will have enough where with time you can have a nice worm bin. Oh. Royalty Home says, I had no idea that Walmart sold them. Is it for bait? Yes, they do sell it for bait. They don't sell it for anything else, but they do carry worms. And some gas stations too do carry worms for bait. And I hear that they carry, no, they're not only carrying the Canadian and European night crawlers. I hear that sometimes at some gas stations you can even get the red wigglers. Okay, so it's the red wigglers that they have, Kiki. Okay, that's good. Yes. So do they sell them by the pound or do they how do they sell those red wigglers, Kiki? Rana says the problem is that in my country there is no place to bury worms. I have to look for them when myself in my garden. That's why I asked for that info. Oh, okay. Okay. No place to buy worm, not bury, but to buy. Oh, okay. Interesting that you're able to find Canadian night crawlers in your in Canadian night crawlers in Europe. I would think maybe you would find the European night crawlers. It's interesting. Yes, they are in the sporting goods section in the fridge. Okay. The gas stations here carry night crawlers. There they are 30 in a containers for 250. Wow. You get 30 for 250. If you ever try to buy fishing worm in my region, um, you get 12 Canadian night crawlers for 450 and you get 24 for nearly $9 before tax. So that's not a bad price to get 30 worms for 250. Melanie says, we'll try, but I am so scared but we'll definitely try. Yeah, I know a lot of people are kind of not so happy with handling worms, in which case I would recommend that you wear gloves because it can feel a bit weird if they're wiggling in the palm of your hands, and especially if it is one of the larger type of worms. I've been handling composting worms now. I started my vermicomposting. June is going to be 4 years, and I'm quite used to the red wrigglers, and I've been fishing for decades and used to handling regular earthworms and other fishing worms. But the funny thing is, when I got my European night crawlers from Unwhite, I took up one and I threw it down so quickly. I don't know. It felt strange in my hands. I don't know. The body was firm and it was all wiggly. And it's the firmest I've ever felt any worms. It wasn't even a big worm, it was just the normal size of a red wiggler. But I guess the way it was wiggling and how firm it was surprised me, and I quickly threw it down. And since then, I do touch them and everything, but I don't handle them much. And I'm not someone who is afraid of worms, but yeah, I'm not afraid of worms, but I don't like handling them. The only worms I'm comfortable handling with my naked hand or otherwise is the red wigglers. But yeah, you'll get over it. You'll get over it. The more you do it, the more you'll get over it. Yes, so I've been here wondering what I'm going to do when my European night crawlers get big. Am I going to be handling them with my naked hand? But I don't think it should be a problem because I handle the Canadian night crawlers, but the Canadian night crawlers, I use them for fishing, so I don't really handle them the way I would with the red wigglers. But yeah, you'll get used to it with time. Let's see. Canadian night crawl. Oh, yes, there's a lot of money for worms indeed. But then everything in my region is super expensive. Canadian nightcrawlers is a European nightcrawler. This is actually most widely spread worms in Europe. I don't have any idea why people call it Canadian nightcrawlers. I don't know. There is a little bit of difference between the European and the Canadian nightcrawlers. There is a bit of difference, but it's not much. I know that they are very closely related, but then all of the night crawlers have some relations between them. Melanie says, "Oh, that would be me." Yeah. One thing about African night crawlers, gas stations are a good place to sell them. No refrigeration necessary, just self space. Bait shops don't want them because they cannot be refrigerated. Oh, okay. Yeah. See, I didn't know that because in my region you can't raise African night crawlers unless, of course, you're going to find some heated environment to raise them all year round. But yeah, they would not necessarily do well in my environment because if you can't keep them in your house, and a lot of people, the temperature that they maintain in their house in my region is not warm enough for them. Maybe in my house it might be, but yeah, they would still be cold or at least chilly. And then in my garage, I don't really maintain the temperature very high, so they definitely would not do well here. And White says, I don't touch them either, just feed them. Yeah. Well, not necessary for us to be touching them if we're afraid of them. What is important is that we take care of them enough to make sure that they are happy and they are giving us their castings. Canadian night crawlers is not European night crawlers. Both are native European worms. They have not existed in North America, actually, most of the North. Okay, interesting. So they're native to Europe. Nice. Nice to know. American worms are brought from Europe and a few of them from Asia during the colonization period. Yeah, I know a lot of worms came across to the US from Asia, including that, what is that worm called? The jumping worms. What are they called? Those ones that they are trying to get rid of because they're such a menace to the natural environment. But I know they are definitely of Asian origin. It goes back to the days when people worked a yearly migration to get the night crawlers from Canada for selling in the USA. Now they're able to produce them in the US. Nice facts. American worms have died during a big ice age. Really? Whoa, that would have been a major loss for the country with all the hard work that the worms put in to keep the soil producing nutrients for us and amending the soil and all of that. It would be a major loss for them to lose all of their worms or most of the worms during that period of time. Hmm, interesting. There's so much out there to learn, which is one of the reasons why I like doing these lives because then I get to learn so much. That's my that's my almost all species in America and Canada's too are brought in by Englishmen and Frenchmen during colonization. Well, I can definitely see based on my region that worms are need you need to bring worms in because when I first bought this property, I'm living in the city, much to my dismay. Um, there's not a lot of worms. There is really not a lot of worms. Even earthworms, there is just not a lot of them. If you go in areas, woodland and stuff like that, then naturally you would find worms. But like in the city here, you wouldn't find a lot of worms. I've hardly ever been able to find regular earthworms in my backyard. It is only after I started adding a lot of organic matter to my garden before I start vermicomposting that I start to see an increase in the population of worms around me. But no, you would not see a lot of worms in the yard. And when I bought my property, I could not say that the yard is not rich in nutrients because the region where I started planting my first year, the produce that I got from there was phenomenal in terms of size. The largest cucumbers I've ever seen was the first year that I planted out there. So it's not that the land was not fertile, but there just wasn't a lot of worms in there. So, yep, I can see them having to bring worms in. But now they're conscious of us bringing worms in and what types of worms we're bringing in because there is one particular type of worms. I'm still not sure what it is, even though I keep trying to find out what type of worms. I'm wondering if it is these same Alabama jumping worms or whatever it may be that they don't want us to bring here in Canada because worms were brought in and released into the natural environment and they devastated some regions. And the story that I was told is that the worms created too much of an organic environment, and because of that, some of the trees that does not like to have a lot of organic matter around it they died off. So because of that, so I don't know if that is the truth or what the real story is, but they are concerned about us bringing worms into Canada to fertilize the soil of their colonies. Okay, animal bedding and animal dung, no cars, worms spread much faster back then. Yes, so true, so true. But now we have to do everything that we can to make sure that we increase the worm population. And at the rate that things are going, we definitely need those worms to help us control waste in the landfill. And we also need their help in helping us to provide organic food, because there's so many illnesses out there because of chemical fertilizers and chemical pesticides and stuff like that. So we definitely need all of those worms. But we are all doing our little part to see what we can do to help out, eh? Yep, I know my kids are here, ready to go crazy. Hey! Yes, I'm on my live there. Yes, well, everybody is home now, so I guess that means I'm gonna have to end soon because my kids are gonna start playing and making noise all over the place. Well, they were here all along, but their daddy's here, so now they're running up and down excited and making noise. Okay, so I guess I'm gonna be saying goodbye to you guys. Thanks for all your participation. Ciao. You need to do your assignments. Bye. Okay, so it was really fun. I learned quite a bit today. Let's see. Leafy Wiggy says, take care. I will try and get a hold of you for some worms. Okay, no worries. And Melanie says, have a great weekend. Bye. Okay, take care, everyone. I hope you have a safe and wonderful weekend as well. And I'll see you guys on Monday, all being well. Till your next meeting, take care. Okay. Same to you, Rano. Bye. They heard you the first, second, and third time, you know. Play is work and work is play. That is the worm way. Yes, okay.